from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
When babies are born extremely preterm, they face a host of challenges.
And sometimes using preterm formulas for feeding is the best way to help them grow.
Preterm babies are not just small-term babies. Even if they're receiving breast milk or donor breast milk, that milk needs to be supplemented to provide adequate nutrition.
Plus, a new study on adverse childhood experiences in Indigenous communities shows real promise for change.
That was one of the things that was really brought out, was that they're not alone and that there's other people going through things, but you can find resources and ask.
These stories and more on Pediatrics on Call, the podcast on children's health from the AAP. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Pargabalinki. This podcast is for everyone in the medical community, keeping our children healthy and safe.
It's a show by pediatricians for pediatricians.
But anyone who cares about kids will get a lot out of it as well.
Let's start today's episode with a conversation about best feeding practices for extremely preterm infants.
Necrotizing enterocolitis is a disease process that scares all neonatologists. It affects primarily premature babies, and it can come on fast and be deadly.
I haven't been in the NICU in a while, but I remember seeing babies with NEC and witnessing firsthand how devastating it can be.
Honestly, David, I wish we knew more about it. I can say there are some incredible researchers in my field just trying to figure out which babies are at greatest risk, but we aren't exactly sure what causes it.
Well, right now, recent reports might make you think it's formula, but I think pediatricians know the pathophysiology is so much more complex.
I want to invite another neonatologist to the show to discuss this, Dr. Eric Eichenwald. Dr. Eichenwald is chair of the AAP Committee on Fetus and Newborn. He joined us in the past to discuss car seats, and as the neonatology division chief of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, he's someone I get to run a lot of NICU topics by, and I'm excited to share him again with our listeners. Dr. Eichenwald, welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
All right, Eric. So as the only non-neonatologist in this room, I'd love it if you can start by explaining what necrotizing enterocolitis is and who gets it.
Sure, David. So necrotizing enterocolitis is, as you guys said in the beginning, is really a devastating disease that primarily affects premature babies. Term babies can get NEC, but usually it really is prematurity is the greatest risk factor. And the more preterm you are, the higher the risk, and also the longer the risk is during the first several days to weeks of life. While we don't know precisely what causes NEC, we do know a lot about it. We know that the pathophysiology is inflammation in the intestine, which can result in necrosis or death of intestinal tissue. And that can result in the need for surgical removal of those necrotic or dead segments of bowel. But it also can be quite devastating and result in what we call nec totalis, which means the entire intestine has died, and that usually is incompatible with survival. And because the intestines do have bacteria within, sometimes those bacteria can escape into the bloodstream, and babies can develop sepsis and shock and die from the sepsis rather than from the necrotizing enterocolitis directly. So it can be both acute, can come on very, very quickly, can be very serious with babies becoming extremely unstable as the intestines react to this inflammation. Some babies might die, some babies might need surgery, and there can be long-term complications, particularly if you've needed surgical removal of your intestines. So it's a disease that I think neonatologists fear, but we don't yet know precisely mechanisms by which we can prevent it from occurring.
Do we know, are there some protective factors which could help decrease inflammation of the gut and hopefully help prevent babies from getting NEC?
Well, the thing that we know, I think for certain, is that human milk is protective. And there are a lot of factors in human milk that modulate the immune system. And human milk is by far the best nutrition for premature babies, particularly those born at very low birth weight or less than 1,500 grams. If parents are unable to provide their own milk, or if they don't have enough production to deal with the amount of milk that their babies need in the newborn intensive care unit, our next best choice is donor breast milk or pasteurized donor breast milk, which is available throughout the country through donor milk banks. And so most NICUs will offer very low birth weight infants donor breast milk if their parents are either unable to provide breast milk or for whatever reason have decided not to provide breast milk. But neonatologists universally recommend that parents provide breast milk for their babies when their babies are born prematurely, as we do for all newborns. So we know that there are factors in breast milk that are protective because the incidence of necrotizing enterocolitis is lower in preterm babies who receive breast milk and donor breast milk. Some of those factors are negated by the pasteurization process, but we know that donor breast milk also has many other immune modulating factors that can help prevent NEC. And that doesn't mean that babies who are breastfed or receive donor breast milk never develop necrotizing enterocolitis, because they can. And so that's where there's a lot of research going on to understand, are there other things that we can do to help prevent NEC? We know that having a standardized feeding protocol, which most NICUs have about how they initiate feedings and advance feedings, just having that protocol seems to decrease the incidence of NEC, even in breastfed babies. We also know that early feeding, meaning being exposed to colostrum, which is the initial milk from mothers when they start to pump their milk, can be also protective. So early feeding, having a standardized protocol, and being provided breast milk either through the parents or through donor breast milk are strategies that most NICUs use to try to prevent babies from developing necrotizing enterocolitis.
So I've been focused a lot on providing either maternal or donor breast milk. Recently, NEC has made news because of 2 lawsuits with large jury verdicts against formula companies who make preterm infant formula. What's the role of these formulas in nutrition in the neonatal ICU?
Well, preterm formulas are really critical for how we provide nutrition to preterm infants. Some parents elect not to agree to donor breast milk, and those babies will receive preterm formula. Some NICUs don't have donor breast milk available because of some inequities in access. For example, donor breast milk costs about $5 per ounce, even when it comes from human milk banks that get their milk from volunteer donors, but it still needs processing. It does cost something to NICUs, and there's not universal coverage across the country through Medicaid and other private insurers for the cost of donor breast milk. So some NICUs, because of that cost, have been unable to provide donor breast milk to their preterm babies in their NICU. So those babies get formula. And while we know that the incidence of NEC is higher in babies who receive formula, we think that's due to the absence of the protective factors that are present in breast milk, not due to the formula itself. And there is concern amongst the neonatology community because of these lawsuits that some companies might decide to withdraw these products. And that would set neonatology back quite a long way, because preterm babies are not just small term babies. Even if they're receiving breast milk or donor breast milk, that milk needs to be supplemented to provide the adequate nutrition that preterm babies need, including added protein, added minerals, particularly calcium and phosphorus, to be able to grow normally and to be able to grow bones normally when they're born preterm. And so breast milk needs to be supplemented. Preterm formulas contain that supplementation for preterm babies and allow them to grow and to get the nutrition that they need. So I think that we think, as far as the AAP and neonatologists, that decisions about how to feed preterm babies really belong between the parents and the medical professionals who are taking care of, and not making decisions through the court system.
And you mentioned, the supply of donor breast milk, and maybe not all families want it or all hospitals have access. How do we ensure that we can make this available for preterm infants and NICUs across the country?
Well, I think the first thing is to have advocacy across our government entities, particularly at the state level, for Medicaid payments for donor breast milk. That's not universally the case, but I think most neonatologists believe that this is an investment that will save potentially many, many babies from having other problems, from not being able to receive donor breast milk. We believe, through conversations with the human milk banks across the country, that there probably is adequate supply of donor breast milk for all preterm babies across the country. We know that, for example, when there was a formula shortage back in the early years of the pandemic, the amount of donor breast milk that was being provided through volunteers exploded. So women were responding to this need for additional milk. And so there probably is if there were an unmet need, we believe that there would be donors out there that would be able to supply it. Right now, donor breast milk is used for a lot of different babies. Some hospitals use it, for example, in babies who have early transitional hypoglycemia, to try to avoid those babies have to receive formula, which is associated with a decreased longevity of maternal breastfeeding for a term baby. And so there's donor breast milk that's being used for a variety of different purposes. It may need to be, if there's a shortage of supply, be skewed towards the very low birth weight population, which we think would be the most benefit. But there probably is enough that we could, if all NICUs were able to have a supply. We've been told through the Human Milk Bank organization that they would be able to supply almost every NICU in the country.
So, getting beyond the neonatal ICU, if a general pediatrician is seeing a recent NICU graduate in their clinic, what additional nutritional support should they be looking to provide for them, and for how long?
Excellent question. So there are transitional formulas that are available for preterm babies that can meet the additional nutritional needs that ex-preterm babies need when they go home. We do encourage mothers and parents to continue to provide breast milk and to primarily feed graduate preterm babies from the NICU breast milk. But sometimes those babies do need some additional supplementation, and many neonatologists would recommend a few bottles or 2 to 4 bottles a day of this preterm transitional formula to try to provide babies with enough calcium and protein for their adequate growth. We know that sometimes the nutritional content of breast milk can be extremely variable. And so pediatricians, as with graduate preterm babies, should be watching, like they do all the time, for what their growth curves look like, to make sure they're not falling off their growth curve and they're maintaining adequate growth over time. And if there's a need for some additional calories, sometimes that can be provided through these transitional formulas for the first several months after babies go home from the NICU.
So, incredible what you were saying about women donating their milk and the supply that we have. But from what you're saying, too, about these NICU grads, there's a place for preterm formulas here. And what is going to happen if these preterm formulas go away? How will we be able to support our babies then?
Well, that's an excellent question, Joanna, because I think most neonatologists think it would just be a disaster for how we care for preterm babies if these preterm formulas are withdrawn from the market. We're very reliant on them, both, as I said, for circumstances within the NICU for some babies who can't receive donor breast milk for whatever reason, but also as when these babies convert over to, they can't go home on donor breast milk. And so these babies do start at somewhere around 34 to 35, 36 weeks postmenstrual age, will have formula introduced if the mothers are either have elected to stop pumping or don't have adequate supply to meet their baby's needs. And so we do need these preterm formulas. And how we would supplement either maternal breast milk, donor breast milk, or term formulas to meet the needs for preterm infants is extremely complicated and would require, I think, a lot of detailed examination of how we could probably poorly replicate what's available in preterm formulas.
Well, Eric, this has been an amazing overview of necrotizing enterocolitis and some of the complex issues at stake here. Do you have any last takeaways for us that you want to share?
Sure. I think the first thing is really to encourage parents who deliver prematurely, even if they had elected that they were not going to provide breast milk to their baby if it was born at term, that pumping breast milk and providing that for their preterm baby is by far the most important thing that they can do for a baby born prematurely. We really believe that breast milk is the best medicine for a preterm baby, and that really is what can lead to the best growth and development of their child. I think that neonatologists, pediatricians need to advocate for greater availability of donor breast milk for situations where either the supply of the parent is inadequate for whatever reason, or there are situations where the parent is unable to provide breast milk, which does come up on occasion. So I think advocating for greater equity in donor breast milk availability, I think, is something that's very important. And I know that's something that the AAP is currently working on through their advocacy with the federal and state governments.
Well, Dr. Eric Eichenwald, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I always enjoy my conversations with both of you, so thank you.
To learn more about NEC and the National Advisory Child Health and Human Development Council's calls for research on infant feeding, visit our website at aap.org/podcast.
Coming up, we'll look at research into adverse childhood experiences and a sample of largely Indigenous children.
When I think about addressing or lessening adverse childhood experiences or ACEs for my patients, I get intimidated.
I think for good reason, Joanna. ACEs are not easy to address, and they're related to complex social dynamics. On top of that, to help, seems like you have to change entire systems of care, and it feels hard for one person to do.
Well, I was just reading a new study in pediatrics, and it impressed me because it sought to tackle ACEs in one cultural group, Indigenous families, and the scientific and cultural significance was targeted to those families. I don't think I've read anything like it before.
Oh, it's spectacular. I know the article, Preventing Adverse Childhood Experiences in a Sample of Largely Indigenous Children. This is a study that really goes after community ACEs, and it's worth an in-depth talk. Let's invite two of the authors on to discuss, Mona Harrington and Dr. Emily Waterman.
Mona Harrington manages the cultural outreach at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Dr. Emily Waterman holds a PhD in human development and family studies and is a faculty member in developmental psychology at Bennington College in Vermont. Mona, Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As I just admitted, addressing childhood ACEs can feel so daunting. Mona, what are the ACEs Indigenous families face in the United States?
For our culture here, or our community, it is child abuse, drugs and alcohol, poverty. That's a really big one, is poverty. Harsh parenting. Parents actually admitted that they didn't even realize that they were being harsh parenting to their children. And when we talked about it and they became aware of it, they said, we changed. I changed. I stopped yelling at my kids.
How much do these ACEs have to do with having to assimilate to a European culture?
So we know that ACEs among Indigenous youth are rooted in historical traumas related to colonization. So things like forced placement into boarding schools. And the other thing that's specific about ACEs in Indigenous communities is that they're rooted in current day systemic oppression. So things like health inequities, poverty, and current day racism and prejudice.
So, Emily, can you talk about the research base for this study? What was unique or not unique about the population you were looking at?
Our project took place in Rapid City, South Dakota, which Mona can speak more to the 2 Indian reservations that are close by. But because it took place in Rapid City, that really meant 2 things. One is people are moving around a lot. People are moving to and from reservations, might not have a specific address. It means that Mona and our other folks who were finding people, trying to get them to do surveys, trying to get them to show up to programming really worked really hard. And then the other thing is when a program is occurring in a city as opposed to like a reservation, although it was culturally specific, it means that we had to be more inclusive, right? Because we know that there might be different cultures represented.
And Mona, can you comment on those reservations surrounding Rapid City?
Yes, we have the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is about 2 hours away, and then the Rosebud Reservation, which is about 3 hours. But we have many of those people that live here in Rapid City.
To do this study, you created the Tawahi Wichag Wichayapi program, or TWP, which is related to the Strengthening Families program known to address drug and alcohol issues. Emily, what went into forming this novel ACEs prevention program?
Yeah, the Strengthening Families program is really prolific. It's been well studied. It started in Pennsylvania and Iowa among really rural white families living in poverty, and has since been adapted a number of times, several different cultures, several different locations, and throughout the world now. There's been 2 that we know of Indigenous adaptations, and the one that we use came out of University of Nebraska-Lincoln called Binzi Dadi Da. How did we adapt it? Me, Mona, our PI, Katie Edwards. Who else was on those calls, Mona? Leon Leader Charge. We sat on Zoom together and we wrote it together for hours. I was mainly a typist, so Mona can talk about some more about the cultural pieces of the adaptation.
Well, I would love to hear more about that. Mona, this was an incredibly ambitious undertaking. What did you hope that you would see when you implemented the TWP?
We hoped that we could bring our families closer together. The Lakota families that were here, there has been a lot of crime and the stuff that goes on with CPS or DSS. And so we wanted to try to help families come together and find out especially what the children needed. And so when we did this, we did focus groups with children and parents, and we found out some really interesting stuff from the children, that they wanted to have boundaries, and they didn't know if they were loved or not because the parents didn't show that to them. And when we talked to parents admitted they didn't know how to show love or how to even support their child. So that was one thing that we got out of it, was parenting styles, and we use Lakota culture to teach about kinship and how we used to do it before European people came in. And so it was really interesting for some of those Lakota or Indigenous people who were there, because they had grown up in foster care. And so they didn't really have a cultural identity. And so it was a learning experience for some of them. Some of them taught us. They were brought up traditionally, and so they participated and taught us how their families do it. And we always had a Lakota elder with us who was fluent in Lakota language, and our language is actually our culture. So it really made a difference in teaching and learning about our families. For example, some of them never sat down and ate together. So that was how we started out each session, was we had a meal and we had them sit in their little family groups. And we talked about what our session was going to be about and let them kind of discuss. Some of them were like, we don't know what to say. And once our elder started talking, and we, talked about, our first one was love. And so she got up there and talked about doing things from the heart. And it was so awesome to hear all the Lakota teachings, that she brought to us. And the families were really inspired by it. Some of them said, I never was taught to like that. My family didn't talk about stuff like that. And I think that goes back to, both my parents were fluent Lakota speakers, and they never taught us. But we picked up words, when they talked to us, we knew what they were telling us to do. But I think it goes back to when in the boarding schools, they weren't allowed to speak Lakota. They had cut their hair and took their hair away and wouldn't let them learn the Lakota culture. And so that had a lot to do, I think, with how they didn't talk to each other, didn't communicate well with their children, and didn't know how to ask what they needed. And so when we brought that in and started talking to them, it was so good, because they said, well, my child doesn't talk. And so we had a session where we had them come up and say, do you want to hug, or do you want? And some of those kids said, yeah, I want to be hugged. I want my parents to tell me that they love me.
Wow, it seems like there was some incredible feasting, coming together and learning from each other. And did the study find that the TWP actually helped to reduce ACEs in the Lakota community as well? Emily, what were some of your findings?
Yeah, we were just thrilled at our findings. Our main outcome was adverse childhood experiences, broadly defined, although we think that our program was, of course, more likely to affect family-based ACEs like domestic violence, child abuse, harsh parenting, that kind of thing, as opposed to community-based ACEs like gun violence or racism experienced. All right, going back to what our outcomes were, though, we did find reductions in incidents of childhood ACEs, which I cried. I don't know about you, Mona. I was just thrilled, because we know that adverse childhood experiences are really at the root of a lot of childhood trauma and contribute to health disparities. We also found reductions in bullying, victimization, depression, and externalizing behaviors among youth. And among caregivers, we found some effects on intimate partner violence, victimization, and perpetration, which we know is an ACE, right? So caregiver intimate partner violence is considered an adverse childhood experience. Now, we also found some effects on harsh parenting, caregiver depression, and some effects on emotion regulation, social support, and cultural connection, not surprisingly, because our program was so focused on that aspect.
Emily, we interview a lot of researchers, but I don't think we've ever talked to anyone whose outcomes brought them to tears. And we are both just smiling so broadly to hear that from you today. Thank you for sharing. Mona, these outcomes seem so promising, but then this program seems deeply rooted in the Lakota culture as well. Do you have any idea how these findings or tools might translate into other cultures and environments?
One thing that we talked about all the time was connection to each other. Part of our culture is, considering everybody, even plants, trees, everyone's a relative, because somehow we're connected. I mean, everything has a life. We're related to everybody. And so we tried to put that out there. And I think that is with every culture. One of the things was these families wanted to belong. In our community, we talked about all the time to talk to each other. When you see each other and anywhere at the shopping store, would wave at each other. And that was one of the things that was really brought out, was that they're not alone and that there's other people going through things, but you can find resources and ask. I always get people coming up to me and talking to me or asking me, or I'll see people waving at me, and I'm like, oh yeah, or little kids coming running up, and I'm beginning not to recognize the kids because they're growing up now, but they come up and give me hugs. And these people, they really, really want to be with someone that they can connect with. And I think that goes across to other cultures as well, because I think that they all, want that connection also.
Well, this is super exciting, and we're excited by your findings because I think they can make addressing ACEs more doable for communities. Emily, do you have any last takeaways for our listeners?
In terms of last takeaways, I think this was a pilot study. We are excited to do this again and again to try to strengthen the program, to adapt it to other communities of urban Indians or potentially reservations, et cetera, and even beyond that. We'd love to look more at mechanisms. Why did this program impact adverse childhood experiences? We really believe it's because of the cultural awareness and cultural teachings, but we'd like to show that with formal mediation analysis. And then the other thing is, I think this program really speaks to the power of just people with different backgrounds working together, right? So I have a scientific background. Mona has a deep cultural knowledge. And I think this program really just speaks to people with different ideas, different backgrounds working together well.
Mona, any last thoughts on the study?
I think that it brought out to our community that there's a way to make relatives with each other and to treat each other like relatives. And I think that makes a big difference for our community because of where it's at and things that happen here, and that there's a way, and our culture is so deep-rooted in kinship. And I think that's what really everybody wants, is to belong.
Mona Harrington and Dr. Emily Waterman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To read the study, Preventing Adverse Childhood Experiences in a Sample of Largely Indigenous Children, go to aap.org/podcast.
At the end of every episode, we like to leave you with something positive or enlightening. We call this segment Say Ah. David, what's your Say Ah this week?
Okay, well, I had this extraordinary opportunity to take a cooking lesson at the local vegan restaurant, and they are so good. Whatever preconceived notions you have about that, toss them out the window. It was amazing. So we learned to make a Spanish paella, all vegan. And then, I have two vegetarian daughters. So Abby came over the next night and she's learning to cook. So we worked side by side and made a version of this paella that she could eat and enjoy. And it was just such an amazing experience to be cooking side by side with my adult daughter and enjoying that whole thing. And it was just great.
That sounds so fun because I only cook with my 4-year-old because he's very interested in it, and that is less fun. Though we do have a good time. We have a really good time. But cooking with an adult child sounds incredible. My Say Ah is that we are finally moving Zelda out of the bedroom, which is like a little sad, but she's so ready to be in a crib in her own room. She's 8 months now, so didn't quite make it to the year, but you can tell when they're ready, and she's just ready to be in her own space, I think.
Oh, so, well, it's probably an offer for you and for Danny.
Yeah.
That's it for today's episode. If you like Pediatrics on Call, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Pediatrics on Call.
Pediatrics on Call is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our producer and editor is Ann Johnsos. Our audio engineer is Doug Nagel. Joe Puskars is our associate producer, and Susan Martin is our executive producer. Our theme music was composed by Matthew Simonson. Join us next week when we'll get a preview of the fall respiratory virus season.
We'll talk to the chair of the AAP Committee on Infectious Disease, Dr. Sean O'Leary. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Pargabalinki. Thanks for listening.